Welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast, where today's brightest minds in the medical device industry go to get their most useful and actionable insider knowledge direct from some of the world's leading medical device experts and companies.
All right, so regulatory is kind of a big deal, especially for medical device companies. Big shocker, right? Having a good understanding of regulations, regulatory strategy, things of that nature are very, very important to the success of your product in the marketplace. And, while I think this is true for companies of any shape and size, I think it's really, really important for startup companies to get a good foundation from a regulatory perspective, because it will be instrumental in helping you with fundraising and increasing the value of your product and your company, and then ultimately success in the marketplace. So I had a really great conversation with Isabella Schmitt. She is a regulatory affairs consultant with Proxima Clinical Research. So enjoy this episode of the Global Medical Device Podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast. This is your host, founder, and VP of Quality and Regulatory at Greenlight Guru, John Spear. It's a challenging world in this medical device industry. And I don't know, I think we're all, regardless of the shape and size of your company, we all have things that we need to deal with. And while this topic today might skew a little bit more to the startup or the small company, I think there's going to be a lot of tips and pointers that we talk about today that are still applicable regardless of shape and size of your company. So joining me today is a newer but reoccurring guest that we have on the Global Medical Device Podcast, Isabella Schmitt from Proxima Clinical Research. Isabella, welcome back.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You got it. So I know that Proxima Clinical Research, you do a lot of work with companies of all shapes and sizes, and not that the name's a misnomer. I know you do a ton of work on clinical research, but you do a ton of work in regulatory as well, right?
We have a lot of regulatory clients. They kind of span from really early stage to publicly traded companies. So it's a wide range of companies. And obviously, we do clinical as well.
And for a layperson or somebody that might be newer to the medical device industry, you may be scratching your head wondering why a quality and regulatory nerd, that's me, and a regulatory nerd such as Isabella are here talking about business advice for startups. But folks, I've got to tell you that this understanding your regulatory pathway and all the different nuances that are around it is really important to you growing your business. And I thought we could dive into some of these things with Isabella today. So let's just dive right in. So let's talk about the thing that happens a lot where somebody invents something or comes up with this wonderful idea for some new technology or gadget. What are some of the challenges that you've seen there?
Yeah, so sometimes when companies start off with the technology rather than the problem, you can start a company two ways. I have this problem, and then I'm finding a technology to solve that problem, or that's a solution for that problem. Or you have, I have this technology, and where can this technology fit? And if you don't have a clear idea of the problem that you want to solve, you can run into an issue where you have multiple verticals that you're trying to achieve at the same time. And that can lead to a lack of focus for some CEOs, where they're trying to hit multiple markets, so maybe multiple indications at the same time. But the technology has to vary a little bit differently, and the testing that you do varies a little bit differently for each indication. And so there's just this lack of focus where they can't specifically target one thing. And when there's a lack of focus, that makes everybody, investors and everything, nervous.
I think this is, it's not unique to med device. I think it's a common thing. Sometimes folks will come up with, a new gadget or a new app or what have you, and they're trying to find a solution to apply it to. But, I guess perfect world or utopia would be to understand what the need is first, and then to develop a product based on addressing that particular need. I mean, obviously, there's a little bit of chicken and the egg sometimes, but I think the point here is that if you spend all this time perfecting this technology and there's not really a clear market or a clear need for it, it's going to be a tough road to go.
So the one thing that, we try to encourage people to do is develop a minimum viable product. And with that, then they can figure out what they're targeting first. And this is where I stopped designing this product, whether it's a medical device with hardware or like an algorithm, like when do I lock my algorithm? To just because you can, especially with algorithms, you can just perpetually train it and make it better and better. But at some point, if you want to get to market, you have to lock that algorithm so that you can validate the algorithm and then move forward with that. So, it goes for software as a medical device and hardware as a medical device. Like there's this, especially if you're coming from academia or where you're, doing basic research a lot and you're constantly trying to perfect your experiments and, you're exploring and you're in that exploring mindset. You can get into this habit of just perpetually perfecting something and never really bringing it to animals to see if it actually works in animals, or never obviously bringing it into humans if you haven't brought it into animals yet.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen this a lot. And in fact, early on in my career, I might have even been guilty of this, where you run with something, you put your head down, you keep, as an engineer and an inventor and an entrepreneur, you keep thinking of, ways to make it better. Oh, I can add this, or I can do this, or I can do this. And, it's easy to forget to, pick your head up sometimes and to engage people who actually might be using your product and get their opinion. In fact, I remember once we had put our heads down. We focused on a specific product. We thought we understood the needs, and when we kept our heads down for many, many months, and eventually brought the product to market. And let's just say it didn't go. It wasn't well received in the marketplace. We got some feedback like, "Why did you do this? What about that? What about this other thing?" And would you believe that some of the engineers, we even responded with, "Do they not understand what this would do and how this would make this better and this sort of thing?" And it's that we forgot the mission.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is that touches on a point of trying to talk to people outside of the people who are working on the project early on to get their feedback and be receptive to that feedback. So we do a lot of pitch judging competitions for accelerators, and and in that there's an application process that you go through first, and you have to read through people's applications, and then you have to watch their pitch. And during the pitching, some of them, they're more conversational type pitches, and we have to assess whether we think that the CEO or whoever is leading the product development is coachable too, because if they're not receptive to feedback and they're like, "This is my design and this is the right way," then it's hard for anyone in an accelerator, the accelerator staff, mentors, whoever, to advise that person. And it's also hard for investors to get behind that type of person because they're worried that this person's going to just go off the rails and just not focus on the main mission. And that involves talking to outside people and being receptive to feedback. And I guess it goes back to like our last conversation too about advisors. If you're getting multiple different avenues of feedback and people have different opinions, obviously, but you have to be receptive to all that and make a judgment call based upon, either your knowledge or people that you trust or whatever it may be. But you still want to get as much feedback as possible from as many sources as possible.
I mean, I like the whole idea of a minimally viable product, MVP. I don't know how common that term is in the medical device industry. I think it should be more common than it is, frankly. I know that oftentimes that MVP acronym or term is used a lot in software, but I think it has a place in non-software products as well. And I'll boil it down in somewhat simple terms, but I think throughout the entire product development process, you're constantly iterating on your device. You want to build an MVP as quickly as possible, and that first MVP that you construct, if it's software, it might just be wireframes. If it's a hardware or mechanical type of device, it may be a really crude prototype where you've duct taped and glued some parts and pieces together, more as a proof of concept. But the whole notion of prototyping early and often, every time you do that, you should get the voice of user involved in that so that you can learn what's good, what's not good, what needs to be improved upon, and then iterate and so on and so forth. So do you have any, I don't know if you have any tips or pointers on ways companies should embrace this notion of an MVP approach?
Yeah, I mean, well, I kind of think that design controls helps a little bit in that. Because if you're coming up with your user requirements or your customer requirements, called different things, different places, user needs, whatever it might be called, and your product development plan, that at least gets you to focus on some clear ideas of what needs to be done. So the product that you're developing, you have to have some kind of idea, and you're trying to meet those objectives. So, your user requirements or customer requirements kind of falls into your design inputs. And so then you're kind of having this structure around what you're doing. And if you go and make a change to those, you want to figure out why you made that change, justify that change. So that kind of puts some constraints around it so that you don't get in this perpetual cycle of, changing things and tweaking things here and there. Because if you're trying to come up with explanations for why you've changed them and you have to do a bunch of documentation for that, that kind of halts people, which is part of the reason they're hesitant to do design controls in the first place.
Yeah.
Because they just want to keep perpetually perfecting it. But, right. It helps them focus on getting toward a milestone. I don't want to say the finish line because there's this other issue with where people just consider, the finish line is their milestone. So my regulatory approval. And then what happens is, if they haven't gone through their whole plan, they don't understand that there are different milestones along the path to regulatory approval, and their timelines tend to be unrealistic. So they'll say, I'm going to do R&D for a year, and then I'm going to get my regulatory approval 6 months later. And that rarely, ever, if ever, happens. And so if you don't understand the milestones that you need to achieve, one, I can tell you that, working with investors and working as a judge in pitch competitions, when I see someone thinks they're going to get their regulatory approval like that, it's sort of a red flag. It's like, whoa, they haven't delved into this at all. They're just guessing. And the other thing is, when you achieve certain milestones, it increases your value, the value of your company. And so you can go back to investors at that point and say, oh, hey, we've shown proof of concept in animals, and the animal studies, the data look great. Give me more money. And so whoever your regulatory consultant is, and maybe, quality people or product development people, should be able to help you understand what milestones are major milestones and increase the value of your company, because you make a bunch of little milestones along the way, but you may have very big milestones, like a clinical trial, and getting great data on a clinical trial is obviously a really big milestone. And so whoever, a regulatory consultant particularly, should be able to advise you on, this is a major milestone. They're not going to probably be able to tell you the actual financials surrounding that milestone, hey, ask for $2 million at this milestone. That's outside of their scope. But they can tell you this is a big deal when you hit this milestone. You should, be considering talking to strategics or getting more investment capital, things like that. And so, not just looking at the finish line and valuing your company based upon the finish line is actually more beneficial financially in the long run too, because if you're just valuing it, looking at the end, one, you're not considering all the little things in the beginning, and your runway might run out much faster than you expect. And then you lose, the investors lose faith in you, and you lose their trust, and that never bodes well for people.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I'd like to unpack a little bit of that. As you were talking about the design control framework, I I was shaking my head in agreement on that. To me, that's the whole essence of design controls, is the benefit of design controls. And I think the concept of an MVP and iteration and design controls, they're like hand in glove. They go together. I'm reminded of this. I think it's called the 1-10-100 rule. Have you heard of this rule before, Isabella?
I haven't. Mm-mm.
All right. So my crude a summary of the 1-10-100 rule is that if you find an issue early, it'll cost you $1. If you find it a little bit later, it's going to cost you $10. If you find a lot later, it could cost you $100, and then later than that, $1,000, and so on. So, it continues to increase exponentially over time. So the embracing an MVP type of approach and iteration and constant revising and testing and those sorts of things. Every time you do this, you should learn something. And the earlier you find something, the less expensive it's going to be in the long run. Putting this into a design control framework a little bit, maybe it's because I am a big design control nerd. But anyway, I want to make sure that by the time I get the design verification and validation, I want to make sure that the thing that I'm going to be testing has a high confidence or high certainty that we're going to get through those stages, because design verification very, very late in a design and development process. And oftentimes, to speak timeline a little bit, design verification is usually a gating item for me to prepare and finalize my regulatory submission. And then design validation is also just as important, because that's evidence that my product meets the needs of the end user. I don't want to get to an animal study, or I shouldn't want to get to an animal study or a human study and find out that I missed it. So there's lots of little things that I should be doing way before design verification, way before design validation, that are going to be less expensive. They're going to be ways that I can prove that the thing works. And I love to kind of come full circle to the tail end of your comment a moment ago. Doing so actually increases your value along the way. If you are able to take iterations and to show and demonstrate that the product works, and you have some testing to corroborate that and some evidence to corroborate that, that's going to increase investor confidence and probably is going to give you more opportunities to seek follow-on investments as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And, I guess to your point too, you do the little things along the way, especially before, you get to validation and verification, your final ones. But for validation purposes, that's sort of going back to what we were talking about with user needs too, because you want people who are going to be using this device to be able to use the device and for it to be intuitive to them, not to the engineer. So, there's a whole framework for human factors engineering and, usability testing along the way. So you get folks to come in and you ask them questions about the design and, have open feedback. That's kind of one route. And then you can do, sort of what they call formative evaluations, where you can sort of set up a simulation and, have them run through it and figure out where their errors are, so that when you get to that final validation, there aren't user errors associated with it. But that's a whole thing that's a whole different topic that we could just go at into, but just at a high level, that, one thing that I think people don't consider early on in their product development, they don't go into the user testing as much as they should. And then when you run into problems with, user validation at the end, that's a real pain, because you have to go back and make a whole bunch of changes.
Oh yeah. I mean, and you do a verification test, and, I'll just pick like biocompatibility, for example, if that's something that, if you have a patient contacting material, if you don't do some core basic things in advance and you find out that one of your biocompatibility tests fail and you have to change a material. Oh my goodness. I mean, that's like going back to the beginning more than it's not. And the same thing from an animal study or a clinical study. I mean, these are very, very late in the game to find out something isn't going to go the way you thought. And folks, I'm here to tell you, I never had a medical device project ever in the history of my career that went the way that I thought. So there will be twists and turns and pivots that are going to come up. You should just anticipate those and realize that there's things that you can do. MVP is one, but just the iteration concept is key. And getting the end users involved early and often is another that's going to help prevent or at least identify what those bumps and pivots and twists and turns are going to be sooner rather than later. Isabella, I thought we could, before we dive into the balance of the conversation, I want to remind folks I'm talking to Isabella Schmitt. Isabella is with Proxima Clinical Research. Great resource to reach out to. Just go to proximacro.com. As we heard a little bit ago, they're doing work for all sorts of shapes and sizes of company, from startups to very, very large companies, but they're here to help you with regulatory consulting and clinical research solutions. So again, check out what they're doing. Go to proximacro.com. And, we talked about design controls a minute ago and quality systems as well. Yeah, that's something that's near and dear to me and to us here at Greenlight Guru. We're here to help you. We've built the only medical device quality management software solution in the market. It's actually designed for medical device professionals by actual medical device professionals. And, we're winning awards. We're working with companies all over the globe to really help streamline their ISO certification process, FDA inspections, help them breeze through the design and development process as much as possible. And which makes, regulatory submissions such as 510Ks and tech files a little bit easier as well. So if you'd like to learn more about how we can help you, go to www.greenlight.guru. All right. So we sort of start, I don't know that we went on a tangent. I think everything we've covered is good, but
we strayed a little bit, but yeah.
Well, let's pull it back.
I think it's relevant.
Yeah. Let's pull it back into why is all of this important from a regulatory perspective, or maybe a slightly different way to ask the question is, why would a regulatory person like yourself or me, why would all this be important, knowing that at some point in time, we're probably going to have to go down some sort of regulatory path, some sort of submission? How is all this relevant to that?
Ultimately, I guess it is true that one of the biggest milestones is the regulatory approval. And so if you're trying, especially if you have a sort of a technology that can hit multiple indications. So I guess shifting a little bit real quick, there are technologies that are quote unquote platform technologies. And while you do want to have a focus for those technologies, you don't want to ignore the fact that you do have a platform technology. So, that does increase your valuation for investors. If you have a technology that has a large potential, but you don't want to talk about having a platform technology unless you actually do have a platform technology. So if you have like a canister that can collect blood and gas and poop or whatever it might be, that's not really a platform technology. It's a technology like maybe it's a gene, sequencing type of technology. That's an in vitro diagnostic. And you just change a primer and then you can, perform multiple tests. You still want to focus on one test, but, to start off with, but you can be aware and make others aware that you have, a pipeline of multiple tests. So getting back to your question, so if you have this type of platform technology, say, where you have multiple tests, the tests that you pick, so say you pick, and I'm just throwing this out here. I haven't actually done the background research on this one. So, but I'm assuming HIV is a pretty big, if you make a diagnostic claim for HIV, that's a pretty big deal. Whereas if you make a diagnostic claim for the flu, you might be class 2.
Right.
So, class 3, HIV, class 2, flu. So if you pick HIV, you're going PMA route, most likely. And so that is a lengthier route than if you went 510K. And so you want to make sure that if you're picking a PMA route, that your marketability justifies that, because you're going to have a lot more testing that you're going to have to do. you're going to have to do clinical trials. And so you're going to have to raise more money. And so is the market share, the total market for HIV large enough to justify that? Now, that's not to say that, if it's a passion project, you don't move forward with that, as long as you can get the funds, maybe from grants or something. But from, I guess, an investor standpoint, they're looking at, the end goal, the bottom line, which is how much money can I make off of my investment?
Yeah.
And so, you want to make sure that your regulatory pathway, that you're not just picking an indication that's interesting to you, but is going to have this major regulatory burden associated with it. And there's no market to justify that from an investor standpoint. By the same token, you don't want to pick a really easy regulatory pathway, but there's no market. Nobody's interested in this. There's no need for this, test or device out there. It doesn't really make sense. So you don't want to pick that just because it's easy either. And so, you want to understand, hey, this is the regulatory pathway for this device. And this is the market for this device. This is a regulatory pathway for, device 2, and this is the market for that. And then make an assessment of, the pros and cons of both of those, the amount of money you're going to have to raise, the amount of money you're going to make, that type of thing to make that decision. Because if you make a decision, and your regulatory pathway is a lot heavier than you thought, and you're going to investors and you're saying the wrong thing, that's also going to, discredit you. And it's going to make you harder for you to raise money in the future. And if you go forward with an application thinking everything's great and you haven't considered really talking to the FDA or a regulatory consultant early on, and you get, an NSC, which is non-substantial equivalent or something of that nature, and they're like, you need to go do a PMA, that's a huge deal. That's a ton of money that you have to raise after that. So you just want to consider all of that when you're making this assessment, and you want to consider reimbursement along with your regulatory as well, because that will help you, figure out not only what indication you want to target from a financial perspective, but what does your clinical trial need to look like? Maybe you can, do one trial that covers reimbursement and, your regulatory burden, or do you want to separate those because maybe reimbursement's so much more? And regulatory approval is your milestone. So those are all the types of things that you want to consider in this bigger picture, because these are all sort of strategic elements into the overall business, So it's not just the market. It's what does it take to get me onto the market? And then once I'm on the market, how am I getting money from there? Reimbursement, sales, things of that nature.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good stuff there. And, because I hear folks all the time, they're like, I had a conversation with somebody today. They claim that their product is not a medical device, and I read what they claim the product does, and I spent 5 minutes on the FDA website. I'm like, I don't know. It seems like a medical device to me, and in fact, it seems like a class 2 medical device. But there's nuances to this. I mean, this is why understanding what problem you're trying to solve at the beginning is going to inform your regulatory strategy. And there's lots of ways to do this, folks. So there's not a one size fits all. It really is I think in some respects about your appetite. I think it's about the investment climate. I think it's about the market opportunities. So there's lots of factors that weigh in, but there could be a path where you say, I want to go down this path because it's, quote, easier from a regulatory perspective. But to kind of recap what Isabella's sharing, if there's not a market for that thing that you're going to go down this easy path, there's not a market for it, is it worth going down that path? Conversely, if this really cool thing that you're doing, but there's 5 people who would ever use this product, and it's going to require PMA, that's another thing you have to factor in. So lots of twists and turns here. This is why you should reach out to somebody like Isabella and Proxima Clinical Research, because they can help you build that regulatory strategy for all these different scenarios. Conversely, I've also seen a lot of companies that are like, we want this super special indication for use, which is going to put us in a PMA bucket, class 3, going to require clinical trial. But there's a different indication that we can target first, where there still is a sizable market that makes us a class 2. So they'll go down that path first, get the clearance, and then use that as supporting evidence to inform, additional indications for use downstream. So again, there's lots of different variations on this. All of them are possible, but I think to boil it down to one summary statement, understand the business ramifications for and against the decisions that you make, and use your regulatory strategy to help inform that.
Part of it too, when you're thinking of, one other thing is to think about the markets that you're going to target. Are you going to go to the US first or the EU first? In the past, people used to go to the EU prior to the US because it was known to be a little bit easier to get through regulatory approval there. Obviously, now that's not quite the case. And then, now we have people coming in through, like I mentioned before, to use the FDA to learn about what they might need to do for the EU. So it's kind of shifted. So understanding the regulatory landscape in the markets that you're targeting is important too, because you made a choice to go to the EU first now based upon, past information. You might be held up longer than if you had targeted the US first. So that's just another sort of element to consider into the bigger picture of where you target your regulatory, what markets you're targeting for regulatory and for selling. You want to be able to justify all of that.
Yeah. And let me qualify when Isabella says easier. Don't hear that it's easy. Hear that it's more predictable.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. And just to kind of elaborate on that, I had a different conversation with a company a couple weeks ago, and, they're new to medical device. They're a startup. And, I do applaud them because they've done their homework. They know the importance of a regulatory strategy. They know the importance of building a QMS. They understand enough about design controls to know how important that is to inform the design and development and risk and all those sorts of things. And, they're like, oh, we want to be to market in the US, the EU, and Canada by end of this year. And I'm like, well, okay. Well, so I asked a couple of clarifying questions to find out where they are in that process. Are they at the very beginning? Are they somewhere in the middle? But then I explained, I was like, that time frame is probably not realistic in the EU today because of all the things that are happening with the EU MDR. It's maybe doable in Canada, but Canada, you're going to have to get MD-SAP and ISO certified, which, there's a little bit of a backlog there. And I said, it's probably your fastest path to market for their technology is going to be the US. Now, your situation might be different, of course, but understand all the things that are happening in the different markets that you're going to go in, because 3 years ago, 4 years ago, heck, maybe even just a couple years ago, the EU might have been a faster path, but that's probably not the case for just about anything medical device related these days. US is probably going to be faster than the EU, not in all cases, but in most cases. So it certainly has flipped on itself. All right.
Definitely. Faster is probably a better word than easier. That's the best word, I think.
Yeah. But even fast, sometimes people are like, oh, I got a prototype. I should be able to sell it tomorrow. It's like, all right. So, folks, be open. If you're in this situation, just be open to listening to people like Isabella, listening to people like me. We've done this many, 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 many times. We're not idiots on the topic of quality and regulatory. So we're here to help you. We want you to be successful. So Isabella, any other thoughts to kind of wrap up this conversation about how important regulatory is in fundraising and beyond?
Yeah, I think that maybe the bottom line here is to understand what you are targeting. So having that focus, because and you can take regulatory into consideration in that focus. But if you can't give even a few different options for focus, it makes it difficult for any regulatory person to give you, a timeline of, a plan for what's likely to be expected when you should go in front of the FDA. So all of these things really boil down to understanding what it your main goal is and moving forward to achieving that goal, and being able to convey that to investors, accelerators, different audiences, whoever it may be that you're trying to get some sort of value proposition out there to them, and, make your company look like it's going to meet its milestones, give yourself some integrity, so that you can say with confidence, this is our timeline, and you're not going to go back and shift it a million different times because you're trying to rush things through, and trying to focus on too many things at once. So having that focus and really putting forth a plan that involves regulatory and quality and product development all into one, will help gain confidence overall.
Absolutely. Well, Isabella, once again, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insights on these important topics. For frankly, I know we said at the beginning this might be skewed to a startup, but this was ubiquitous across all shapes and sizes of medical device company, because even within a well-established company that's been in business for decades, that has a whole portfolio of products, you still have, quote, investors within your organization. You probably have processes where you have to go through different stages or phases in order to get additional resources and funding for those projects. So this methodology, these tips, these pointers that we shared with you are definitely applicable in your world too. So I hope you found something worthwhile. Again, folks, check out what Proxima Clinical Research is doing and how they might be a resource to help you. Go to proximacro.com to learn more. As always, thank you so much for being a listener of the Global Medical Device Podcast. If this is your first episode, welcome. There's well over 100 episodes that you can listen to as well. And if you've been a loyal listener for a while, again, thank you as well. Be sure to share news about the Global Medical Device Podcast, the #1 podcast in the medical device industry, with your friends and coworkers. And until next time, this is your host, founder, and VP of Quality and Regulatory at Greenlight Guru, John Spear.